Alright, finally your boy is back. Let's move on to science. So in this video, we are going to be looking at the non-renewable energy sources. So there are 4 non-renewable energy sources we're going to be looking at today. Oil, nuclear, coal, and natural gas. So let's start with oil. Let's look at the creation of oil. Oil is a non-renewable source. This means that it is limited and has to be created throughout time. And we need to use this oil very wisely. So if we were to look at the creation, which is this paper right over here, we'll start at step 1. Basically, oil takes hundreds of millions of years to form. The dead plants and animals, when they die, they sink down to the oceanic crust. Note, this is only happening in the ocean, not on the surface ocean. So when the dead plants and animals, when they sink to the bottom of the ocean or the oceanic crust, what happens is that dirt and silt start to pile up on top of the dead material. Because of that, this creates heat and pressure. This heat and pressure slowly starts to break down the dead material. As time continues, it breaks down so much to where it turns into a liquid state. This liquid state is dark and thick, and we know this as oil. Okay, so now let's see what us humans do to the oil. We extract the oil from its oil reserve up with this oil rig, which is right over here. When we take the oil rig up to the surface, it's taken to an oil refinery. Here, according to the different temperatures and how long it's being heated, it's then classified into separate groups of oil. These separate groups of oil are what we know as petroleum, diesel, crude oil, plastic, fertilizer, etc., etc. Now, let's see the effects of oil. The effects of oil is that when it's burned, it releases a harmful gas. This harmful gas is bad for the environment as well as the atmosphere and for our lungs. If we were to ever breathe this gas, it would be really bad for our lungs, and this could lead to illness and death. Now let's move on to coal. Coal was massive in the 1800s and especially during the Industrial Revolution. Let's move back onto science. Now the reason why coal is so important is because that it's very cheap and abundant around the world. And the reason why is because coal is mostly created in swamps. Swamps are found everywhere, so that kind of makes sense. Basically, what happens in the swamp is let's look over here on this paper. They take the dead plants. Now, let's pause over here. I just said dead plants, but if we were to go at petroleum or oil, it needs dead plants or animals. But here, it's happening with only plants, not animals. Also, another key difference is that this is happening in the ocean, this is happening in a swamp. The dead plants, when they die, they sink to the bottom of the swamp. When they sink to the bottom, again, just like the petroleum, the dirt and silt and sand start to pile up on top of the dead material. This creates heat and pressure, which is then compacted and cemented into a solid structure known as coal. And we use the coal because coal is really good for burning things and is a nice way to generate electricity. Now let's look at some effects of coal. Coal is pretty bad to the environment, and the reason why is because it has this thing called sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide is very bad for the environment as well as for our lungs. It can create illness and death just like oil when burned. Next is natural gas. So natural gas works pretty similar to petroleum or oil, except this time what happens is it comes through a different state of matter, which is instead of liquid, gas. So basically, it takes the same way as oil, like it takes the dead plants and animals, and it sinks to the bottom. But what happens here is that the gas comes when a crack in the earth's structure starts to seep in. This takes the dead material and then converts it into natural gas, and then seeps up through the earth's surface. we also use a rig and we take the natural gas. Fun fact, natural gas is much more cleaner than all the other fossil fuels. And the reason why is because it is a gas and it does not really need to be burned as much as oil or coal. If you haven't exactly understood that, basically it's the same way oil is formed, but this oil, it creates a methane gas. This methane gas is then seeping up to the Earth's surface and we collect that gas, making natural gas. Natural gas is mostly used in cooking and heating homes. Next is nuclear energy. So nuclear energy is man-made, unlike all the other three we've talked previously. So let's see how nuclear energy is made. Nuclear is a new type of scientific way to create electricity or generate electricity. Basically, what happens is we take uranium, a material that's found deep in the Earth's surface, we take that, zoom literally all the way to the uranium's atoms. What happens when we zoom into the uranium's atoms is that we try to split the atoms. These atoms are, when we try to split the atoms, it's called fission. If you haven't known, that's what our sun does too. Basically, it splits the hydrogen and helium atoms, and when it splits it in half, it creates an enormous amount of energy, creating solar flares. Just like that, when we split the uranium atom, it creates an enormous amount of energy, and if not used properly, then what happens is that it'll create an enormous explosion, releasing radioactive waste. Fun fact, scientists have not figured out how to dispose radioactive waste. So right now in nuclear power plants, we're generating the electricity, but what's happening is all that radioactive waste, pretty much scientists are storing it somewhere, but they're still figuring out how to dispose of it or how to get rid of it. So let's say a nuclear power plant goes bad and the whole thing collapses. What happens is that it releases bad things into the air and environment, making organisms get sick and die, as well as creating new hospitable and really dangerous things to the environment. Even though nuclear energy is man-made, still the uranium is non-renewable because it still needs to be mined just like the other three. And these gases come in three forms: solid, liquid, and gas. Four non-renewable energy sources: oil, nuclear, coal, and natural gas. So if you didn't know, oil is liquid because it is a petroleum. Coal is solid. Natural gas, if you look at the name, it's already gaseous state. And this is somewhat solid. Except for nuclear energy, oil, coal, and natural gas consist of hydrogen and carbon.